All right, good evening. Welcome, everybody. I'm Doug Zemeckis, a county agent with the Rutgers Cooperative Extension. Thanks for joining us this evening for our Earth Day Everyday program. This is our fall seminar series. The title is The Winds of Change, Environmental Impacts from an Altered Climate. Today is 6 of 6 to wrap up our fall series, a mixture of terrestrial and land-based topics that we've been covering. This program is offered through Rutgers Cooperative Extension, providing science-based educational programming to improve the quality of lives, businesses, and communities throughout the state. And this is one of our many programs, the Earth Day Everyday program. Tonight, we have Dr. Ken Abel, Distinguished Professor Emeritus from Rutgers University, who will be presenting about changes in our southern New Jersey estuaries. We have a 1-hour program planned for tonight, about 45 minutes presentation from Ken, and then I'll be moderating for the question and answers portion at the end of his presentation. If you have a question for Ken, please drop it in the chat directly to me, moderator Doug Zemeckis. I'll organize them and we'll get through as many of them as we can at the end. Next slide, Ken. And if you can actually hit it one more time as well, actually. At the end of Ken's presentation, while the questions and answers are going on, my colleague, Dr. Amy Rowe, is going to initiate a poll, a survey that will pop up on your screen. That's a program evaluation survey where we're interested in getting your feedback about what you learned during tonight's presentation from Ken Abel and our administration of the program, getting information on what you learned and what behavior practices you might adopt as a result of what you learned this evening. This survey and a follow-up email that you'll get to participate in a survey approximately 6 months afterwards are considered research by our institutional review board to get your feedback through that survey. As a result, we need your consent to participate in that survey and this research, and the information is used to improve the quality of our outreach programs, such as Earth Day Everyday and others. So the first question will be whether or not you consent to participate and provide your feedback. We hope that you will, but if you elect not to, then you can click the option no at that time. Next slide, please, Ken. So Rutgers Cooperative Extension is an equal opportunity employer and program provider, providing science-based educational programs for clientele throughout the state of New Jersey, offering these programs without discrimination and to as many people as possible, including this Earth Day Everyday program where we're hosting the webinar live tonight, but also recording it to post it up publicly on YouTube along with others from this program to make this information available to as many people as possible. Next slide, please, Ken. With that, I'd like to formally welcome and thank Dr. Ken Abel for joining us this evening. A real pleasure and honor to have Ken present this evening. We haven't hosted him in a few years for one of our marine extension programs, so a great opportunity. I'm confident we're all in for a treat tonight. Ken is a distinguished professor emeritus from Rutgers University. He started working at Rutgers in 1977. There was really something in the water locally that kept him here. He was the director of RUMS, or Rutgers University Marine Field Station, which is that station that you see there in his title slide that we're going to be learning about. He served in that role for 33 years as the director of the Marine Field Station before retiring in 2019. He studied a wide range of species near and afar around the world and all throughout New Jersey's estuaries, coastal and offshore waters, primarily working on finfish, but a variety of other environmental, habitat, and other issues. Published well over 300 articles in peer-reviewed scientific journals and many different books, several of which we'll be hearing about today. And those are his continued pursuits in his retirement status, focusing in on the Great Bay Mullica River estuary, the larval fish that inhabit our local estuaries and beyond, including the history of Station 119, our marine field station. So clearly, Ken has a wide range and long history of experience studying finfish, our coastal habitats, and it's a real pleasure to have you, Ken, this evening to talk to us about your expertise and perspectives related to changes in southern New Jersey's estuaries. I'll turn it over to you.
Doug, thank you. And for everybody else who's plugged in, thanks for Thanks for attending. I hope we have a good discussion at the end. One of the most important things I want to make you understand, help you understand, is a lot of what's on the screen that you're looking at now. There are extensive marshes, extensive estuarine marshes in much of New Jersey, including South Jersey and into Delaware Bay. And they're really quite extensive. And many of them, like the ones you see here, are relatively unaltered. And that applies to the Mullica River Great Bay estuary. And so we use that as a baseline, a place for extensive studies that we interpret in a whole host of ways and interpret relative to other places, other estuarine places in particular. Um, as Doug mentioned, this has been going on a long time. And as a result, there are lots of people that need to be acknowledged for their assistance. And a lot of them are listed very generically there, but it would take an hour to list all those individuals who have been involved. I'd like to thank Nicole especially for helping with the organization of the slides for this. So a little bit of background. This shows some of the books that I've written in an attempt to translate what we've learned at the field station over the last 30 plus years. So Doug mentioned a history of the station that provides perspective for the area. Another book is Beneath the Surface that talks about what we don't often get to see is what's going on under the surface of the water. And another one that was fairly recently published based on aerial imagery to help interpret our coastal landscapes. More importantly, relevant to tonight's presentation is a book that is submitted. It'll probably be out next year sometime. And it's focused on the road down to the station, Seven Bridges Road, if you live locally, Great Bay Boulevard if you don't. But it's these kinds of places that are critical to our understanding of these systems. And that's why I want to mention for a second what we call the ecology of place. So it's just as it says there, a general pursuit of a general understanding through detailed understandings of a particular place. And that has really been the basis for what used to be natural history has now become ecology. And that place incorporates a spatial location and often a very distinctive and long-term time period. So those kinds of places are a real advantage. Uh, it allows a basic understanding of the system. And so field stations like that at Rutgers are really critical to understand what's going on. And that our presence there provides for an improved understanding of the dynamics, both short and long term, of these systems. And one example is storms relative to climate change. Uh, so these systems are special in that they are relatively unaltered. We contend that the Mullica Great Bay system is the cleanest estuary in New Jersey. And more importantly, it's one of the cleanest on the East Coast of the United States. And I have to tell that to people from elsewhere often because their mental image of New Jersey is the turnpike. And in fact, that's not the case. And our system, our estuary, the Mullica Great Bay system, is an exceptional one. Because of that, we have used that as a baseline for comparison to other systems. So we have worked, for example, in New York Harbor, the estuary of the Hudson River, right around Manhattan, a little bit different system, few millions of people there, lots of concrete, lots of people, lots of traffic. But we often come back to our understanding of the Molucca Great Bay System because it provides that baseline. Similarly, we've worked in the Gulf of Mexico, Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Um, when that oil came ashore and coated Louisiana marshes, we spent several years down there, and some of that work is continuing to try to understand. But we often come back to our own system, our backyard, uh, where we have a seat of the pants understanding of how these systems work. We come back to our backyard for a better understanding of these other places. And just as a reminder, these estuarine systems, especially the marshes, provide numerous ecological services. Um, I'll just point out a few that are on that list there that occur in natural marshes. That's where the plus signs are. High production at base of food chain. The marsh grasses that grow there are among the most productive in the world. They're more important than fertilized cornfields in terms of their productivity. They're nursery grounds for small fishes and crustaceans. They're feeding grounds. They're habitat for wildlife, a whole host of things, including our attempts to understand carbon storage. So there are a lot of pluses under those natural marshes. And so what I'm going to do is talk about some of these services and some of the habitats. And then at the end, we're going to come back and look at that last column and try to understand what marshes are like under sea level, under current sea level rise situations. We're going to use a lot of different approaches to get to that. From a landscape scale, we spend a lot of time on helicopter flights over the system. That's what you see represented in the upper left. But at a smaller scale, we've used drones that you see in the upper right to get finer scale understanding of those landscapes. That's critically important. And, you know, as soon as I get up in the air, I began to see things that I didn't understand, didn't experience when I was walking through the marshes. It gives you a broader sense of what's going on. In the lower left is an image, a side scan sonar image underwater. And this helps us penetrate the surface, understand what's going on under the surface. But there's nothing like sort of what we call ground truthing that imagery and our own experiences, like you see in that lower right image there. So we've spent a lot of time kayaking throughout the system over all seasons, many years, different stages of the tide, a whole host of things. And that is somewhat represented by this map. So in the lower right is Great Bay. Above that, with the red squiggles on it, is the Sheepshead Meadows Peninsula, where the station is located. And as you go upstream, you encounter the Bass River, the Wading, and the Molucca almost all the way up to Hamilton. And we've done this in a variety of ways. This just shows the spatial scale. It doesn't show how many times we did this. But the green represents areas we've traveled by motorboat, and it would just get too busy if I put everything on there. But we've spent, like it shows there, 172 miles by kayak throughout the system. Those are the red lines. So again, this is why I say we have a good seat of the pants understanding of the system from a variety of views. So this is what I want to do tonight. I've already given you a little bit of background. I want to talk about climate and sea level rise as it is occurring now, or at least in human history. And then I want to try to interpret what are some of the responses to the climate change and sea level rise, especially in marshes. And then I want to talk a little bit about other human influences like the Phragmites invasion and other alterations to the system. And then I'll spend a few minutes talking about climate and sea level rise in the future. And you note it says projections there. We certainly don't know what's going to happen, but based on our experience, we're gaining some understanding, and I'll try to mention that. So if we start at some of the earliest humans, on this slide that you're looking at there that's Seven Bridges Road. If you're familiar with it, in the upper center of it is where it crosses the first bridge on the way down to the station. This is a marsh in winter, but that patch of woods there that you see in the center is actually a very well-known patch of property. It's called the Tuckerton Mound, and it is the remnants of hundreds to thousands of years of collection of mostly hard clams and oysters by the Lenape, who lived locally. And they put these shells in these middens, collected them there over time, and that's why they're higher than the surrounding marsh. So that in itself provides us an index. So if you look at the outline of that patch there, and if you look at the upper left-hand figure, you'll see the white indicates that area, sort of approximately, based on a number of transects and so on. And this is work done by a lot of the collaborating faculty and so on from the area. A lot of archaeologists, a whole host of people. In the lower right, the gray area represents the same image, same area that you can see today, but you see the light brown area is the extent below the marsh. So at one point, at an earlier sea level rise, that mound, that midden, was much, much larger than it is now. But if you go out with a long piece of rebar, poke through the marsh there, you can hear it clink, 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 because there are shells accumulated there that have been there for hundreds to almost thousands of years. What's the significance? Well, sea level is rising, and the salt marshes are able, to some extent, to keep up with that sea level rise. They collect sediments, put roots down, and build up the marsh. And so that only happens under a situation where sea level is rising. So this represents a couple thousand years. But we have things closer to hand. This is a very lousy photograph. And if you stare carefully, you can see in the center of the photograph is a man standing there. This is from the Star, let's see, I think it's the Newark Star Ledger in the early 1950s. And this is when they were constructing the current bridge, current Garden State Parkway Bridge over the Mullica River. And they had a lot of problems because they were trying to put in supporting structures for the bridge, but about the time they got 40 feet down, they kept encountering all kinds of very hard wood. And you can see that large wood that they accumulated there. So 40 feet down, there was a former forest, a Atlantic white cedar forest. This stuff doesn't rot, it hangs around forever. So in order for the Atlantic white cedar can only tolerate fresh water, cannot live in salt water, but it's all salt water up that way now, and it's a function of sea level rise. So the time it took to accumulate 40 feet of sediment is how long sea level has been rising. And this is another indication of sea level rise in the system. All of that resulting from the changing climate and the warming of the earth and the melting of the glaciers, very, very simplistically. But we can look at it in a little more detail if we look at New Jersey average temperatures. This is from 1895 on the left to 2022 on the right. and the horizontal line is the long-term average. But if you look since about the 1970s, and that purple line, you see a pretty dramatic increase in air temperatures. Well, if the air is that warm, the water is going to be warmer. And, if you've been paying attention at all, you know that 23 and 24 are some of the warmest air temperatures and water temperatures in New Jersey in recorded history. So there's a clear warming trend, and that has all kinds of impacts. And if we look at this in a little more detail, fortunately for us, there has been an active tide gauge in Atlantic City, which is very close to the field station and the estuary. That's been there since 1912, and that's what the axis at the bottom shows. That's years. On the right axis, or let's see, yeah, on the right axis is sea level rise in feet over that time. The red line represents year-to-year variation in tide level. The blue line represents the average, and you can see since 1912 up to I think it's around 2022, there's been a dramatic increase in sea level, and it's measured at the same place with the same technique over this time period. So this is really good data. The striking thing is that the green line shows the global average of sea level rise over that same period. This is work by Ken Miller at Rutgers and others. So the global average is the green line, the Atlantic City average is the red line. Approximately, sea level rise indicated in Atlantic City is about twice the global average. So in New Jersey, sea level is rising twice as fast as it is most other places in the world. Why is that? As it's labeled there, it's primarily a function of subsidence. So during the last glaciation, there was 1 to 2 miles deep ice over New York and parts of northern New Jersey. If you can see this if you drive up the Parkway and pay attention to the highest land when you're near Cheesequake State Park there. That's some of the remnants of the outwash from the last glacier. So we had lots of weight over North Jersey as all of that weight caused the land to sink up there, but in South Jersey, it actually caused it to bulge up. Scientists would say that's isostatic rebound because as the glaciers have melted, that land has risen, but places like South Jersey are subsiding. So we have sea level rise due to glaciers melting, but we also have that isostatic rebound due to the subsidence. So that's why our average sea level rise is about double the global average. So we need to keep that in mind through the rest of the talk. But this is what it's reflected in. Some people call this sunny day flooding. In other words, this is not these high waters that are completely covering the marshes along Seven Bridges Road. The green in the background is the mainland. If you squint, you could see the water tower in Tuckerton right here. And so you come down the road and the station is this way. So it's covered the whole marsh, but it's a sunny day. Why is sea level so high? One, because the water levels are rising and the marshes are subsiding. So this is what our commute looks like many days. And remember, that's salt water. That's the station in the background. That's salt water. So you don't want to be driving your car through it if you can help it at all. So we see more and more flooding, and that's expressed in this graph. So on this axis here, it's hours the road was flooded. On this axis, we've had a tide gauge in our boat basin since around 2002. So up to, and this graph represents up to about 2019. And each of these dots is an annual average for the amount of flooding. We know that at 2.6 feet on the gauge, the tide gauge, water starts flooding the road. We want to know that because we don't want to drive through the salt water. But if you look at the overall pattern, it's variable from year to year, but the long-term trend is the road is flooding more often. The reality for us is if someone says, well, let's meet at the station at 9 o'clock. Now we ask, can we meet at the station at 9 o'clock if the tide is going to be flooding? So this is a much more frequent occurrence, and it's another index of sea level rise. And again, this is why I say we have a seat of the pants understanding of climate change and sea level rise. So what are the responses? What are the kinds of the responses in the estuaries? This picture demonstrates one. This is a marsh edge calving off, not unlike a glacier calving off in the Antarctic or the Arctic or Greenland. That marsh is calving off because the marshes aren't keeping up with sea level rise. They're not collecting enough sediment to do that. And so they weaken at the edges and they calve off. And you can see in this overhead example here, this is one of the thoroughfares that runs through the peninsula. And in the middle image, you can see the marsh breaking off or calving off. And again, this is due to sea level rise. The marsh is not keeping up with the sea level rise, not getting enough sediments to do that. And in the bottom image, you see one of those chunks of marsh. That marsh is very dense. It's dense peat, and it calves off and then sinks into the bottom of the creek. But you see this too many places. So this is an example of the Sheepshead Meadows Peninsula. You see the inset on the lower left shows its location. The station is at the end. Seven Bridges Road goes right down the middle of that peninsula. But all those black dots in those different thoroughfares represent, where we have identified peat calving off from the marsh edge. And we've also looked at under the surface with side scan sonar, and you can see it quite clearly. So it's variable from thoroughfare to thoroughfare and even within a thoroughfare, but we're losing marsh at the edge. This is also why these channels and creeks are getting wider. It's simply due to sea level rise. The most dramatic response is, so this is the upper left image is 1995, lower image is 2019. And if you look at the, if you look at, this is the station, this is the causeway coming down from Seven Bridges Road to the station. So look at the edge. Here it is in 1995, 2002, 2007. And a good landmark is to look at the old meteorological tower that sits here as well. And so you may or may not be able to tell that that edge of the marsh is receding, and the composite image here shows all those different years at one time. So it is lost from here to here. And in fact, we've lost about 140 feet of marsh edge. A lot of it is from calving off from the marsh edge due to the lower sediment levels not keeping up with sea level rise. So that's what's happening on the edge of the marsh. And that's what most people look at when they think about, oh, we're losing our marshes. And this is another depiction of that same thing over the meadows. And the pink purple lines represent data from 1930s, aerial imagery from 1930s. And some places it's really quite striking. So at the end of the peninsula there, so you can see where we've lost lots of marsh down here. That's and we've lost marsh all along the edge, and you begin to understand what those kinds of effects are. Most people don't know that at one time in the mid 1850s, there was a hotel at this location. Oops. At the end of the peninsula. And there was another one over here at the mouth of Hatfield Creek. Those sites, based on the work of others and some of our own, those sites are now underwater. Sea level is rising. And that's happening on the adjacent islands as well. So these are the islands. These are called the Seven Islands. This is where the fish factory is, if you're aware of that. These are what I refer to as the Story Island complex. And they have lost marsh edge as well. So for example, I wrote down some numbers so I would remember. So the islands to in the top figure over at Story Island, by and large, the average loss around the perimeter of those islands is from 10 to 61%. So, or 62. So at this marsh here, East Sedge, it's lost 62% of the land since 1930. Others are less, and on occasion, there's a new island formed, like at Goosebar Sedge at the other. But by and large, we're losing marsh at the edge. Over at Seven Islands in the lower figure, the same thing happens. And a place like Toe Island, which is right in the intercoastal waterway, has lost 80%, 86% of its marsh. So there are multiple indicators of sea level rise, and the main response is marsh loss. You know, why one can ask, well, why do we care? Is it so critical? But the marshes are what fuel the whole estuarine system. That primary production from the marsh grasses growing is very productive. And in the wintertime, it dies back and it breaks down, and the plant material breaks down into what we call detritus. And that detritus is the basis of the estuarine food web. So when we lose marsh, we're losing some of the marsh productivity from the very base of this. We can see it in other ways. So in the center inset, you see A and B there. A is at the top, and that image in the upper left represents what the marsh pools on the marsh surface look like in 1930. And on the upper right, they look like the same area. You can see the creek. Here's this creek. It's the same creek over here. But you can see how much more extensive the marsh pools are in this image. The same thing happens at location B here. This is what it looked like in 1930. This is what it looks like just a few years ago. So not only are we losing marsh at the edge, we're losing marsh on the interior because the marsh pools are in effect what I refer to as lakes. They're becoming much larger, and as a result, the marsh grass isn't growing there, and we're losing that productivity. So I'll give you some aerial images that you can see. So this is one of the marinas going down the road, but look at all this open water on the marsh surface. And what happens is these small pools get larger and larger, and they coalesce. Here's another example. Here, 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 here. So we're losing it at the edge, but we're also losing marsh at the interior as well. And this is a really good example for perspective. This is the fish factory, if any of you guys are familiar with that area. But look at the extensive marshes, and you can see all these small marshes coalescing and forming larger pools, or like I said, what I call lakes. So we're losing marsh grasses. Here's another example. This is one of the islands. This is one of the gunning shacks that's been out there for years and years. This is on Hither Island. And you can see the bulkhead here. This is where the shoreline used to be. So it's receding, losing marsh at the edge, but look at the interior. There was not this much standing water in the 1930s, as an example. Those are just our first aerial images. So again, a good example of how we're losing our very productive marshes. And as a result, we're losing the services that are provided by those marshes. Another image of the same thing, here's Story Island. I can't pick out the gunning shack on this, but look at all of this here, all of this here. So large open areas of standing water that didn't used to exist. This is over at Seven Islands. The fish factory is here, and you can see all the standing water. So getting up in the air, you can begin to appreciate how much these marshes are changing. If you just drive down the road, you can't see this. It isn't as obvious in most places. So, we think this is what's happening. And by we, I mean me, but a lot of people who know much more about the botany of marshes than I do. But because the marshes are not receiving as much sediment and sea level is rising, there's much more standing water on the marsh surface. Small pools like this form, even though the marsh grasses love to be intertidal, love to have 2 highs and 2 lows a day and do quite well in it. When there's standing water, the vegetation dies, the roots die, and you see these small pools forming that eventually coalesce to form lakes. So someone has diagrammed this quite well, so that what I was trying to describe to you with the aerial image is what most people call runaway marsh fragmentation. So a marsh with no pools, one pool, and then many other ones form, and then many others form. And depending on the particular marsh, there's a lot of variation between marshes, but this is what's happening besides what's at the edge. And then obviously, if sea level rise continues, then you end up with a drowning threshold in which the whole marsh drowns. What we would like to be able to do is recover a lot of that vegetation and so on. But we're we're not keeping up with sea level rise, and so that's not happening very well. So we're back to that table that we saw earlier. So the last column shows for all those services what it might look like with marshes under sea level rise, what we're experiencing now. So the negative sign says we're losing ground relative to a natural marsh. So we're losing some of that production. We're losing that refuge and foraging grounds, the nursery areas. We're losing the buffer against storm wave manage, and we're losing shoreline stabilization, all things that the marshes provide. But you see, there's a lot of question marks there, and that's because we just don't know. I tell my students all the time, I am continually impressed by how little we know. We're trying to manage these systems. We're trying to restore them, but often we lack a basic understanding of how these things are happening. We're learning, but we're learning slower than the sea level is rising, at least in my opinion. So, and then I want to talk about some other human influences. So this is back on Seven Bridges Road again. The road runs through the center of the slide, and the upper portion is the kinds of marsh loss in the interior. And this is what it eventually looks like, what I'm calling lakes. And we've kayaked in these lakes. They're shallow, but they're bigger and bigger all the time. What about at the bottom of the slide? That also has lots of open water, and it looks somewhat similar to the top of the slide. But in fact, this is the result of a mosquito control attempt through what's called open marsh water management. So these are actually dug out to provide refuges for fishes, which eat mosquito larvae, and they put the sediment back on the marsh, but they open up the marsh surface so that in some ways looks like what we're experiencing under sea level rise. So some would suggest that we're actually making the problem worse, at least relative to sea level rise. Is that true? I don't know the answer. I wish we did, but it's one of the things that we should be addressing. Another form of human influence is we have a number of invasive species, but one of the things that's common in most estuaries on the east coast of the US is the development of Phragmites or common reed. And if you've been out at all, you see this reed growing all along in many, many places. But this is the native Phragmites. We actually got to a place on the Great Egg Harbor River where there is a patch of living natural Phragmites. It typically lives right at the marsh upland interface, and it's very thin and patchy and doesn't get very tall, but this is the native form. But when the colonists came over from Europe, they packed their round bottom vessels with all kinds of casks and crates and everything. But to keep them from moving around, they harvested Phragmites, the native form from Europe, and stuffed it into the bottoms of the ships to hold all that luggage in place. And when they got over to Boston or Philadelphia or New York, they unloaded their crates and dumped the Phragmites in the water. As a result, we now have an invasive form of Phragmites that is very robust. It's like many hybrids. They're more robust than the native forms. And that is beginning to dominate these systems to a large degree. So this is what the native forms, and this site on the Great Egg Harbor River is, as far as we know, the only site in New Jersey where the natural form still exists. Everything else is covered with the invasive form, and it gets very, very thick. When you're walking through a patch of Phragmites like this, if you could walk through it, you can't fall down. It's too thick. And it gets 12 to 14 feet tall. So this is the invasive form. Okay, so let's contrast what its effect might be. This is a diagram showing the invasion over time. So if we start at the top with mostly Spartina marsh along a creek bank, and during the initial Phragmites invasion, and that's what this is represented here, that's Phragmites. A little later in the invasion, it gets thicker, starts to fall into the channel. And what we call mid-invasion, it gets even thicker yet, and more of it falls into the channel. It slows the water flow, sediment drops out, and late in the invasion, somewhat like the previous slide I showed you, the it can actually fill in creeks, and it builds up the marsh surface. And some people would contend that that ability to build up the marsh surface is actually a great way to counter sea level rise. The problem is, if you are cognizant of the effects of Phragmites and wonder about its effects, this is a drone image from up at Clark's Landing. So the Bullica River is at the lower part. There's some pools in here, but you can see this is a lot of this tall stuff here is invasive Phragmites, and it's changed not the Phragmites, but sea level rise has changed. So this is all ghost forest. This is all Atlantic white cedar that has died as a result of sea level rise. It simply cannot tolerate salt water even during a 1 or 2 day storm event. So the Phragmites moves into these ghost forest areas. And some people said, well, we're just creating more marsh and that's okay. But I would counter with it by saying, once we create a Phragmites marsh, we eliminate a lot of the fishes that use that marsh surface, and we don't get as much detritus from these Phragmites marsh. It stays in the marsh, does not get into the system like the Mullica here. So invasive Phragmites happening along with sea level rise that is killing the trees. So it's not as simple as we would like. Sea level is in fact rising, but what about invasive species that we have mistakenly introduced into the system? The critical thing is that the marsh surface, as I told you before, provides a nursery for a lot of animals. What I'm showing you there is a picture of the most important fish in the marsh. This is the mummy chog. These are what most people call minnows, and they fish with them as bait. There's a male during spawning coloration at the top and a female below. But they're only about 3 inches. A 4-inch one is a monster, but they are incredibly abundant. They tolerate all kinds of salinities. They feed on a wide variety of things. They grow quickly. They're very productive, and they're eaten by lots of birds, lots of fish. So that's why they're critical to the marsh food web. But if we think about the effects of the Phragmites invasion on mummy chogs and their habitat, and again, this is set up like the prior slide, this is early in the invasion initially, and early at this time when we measured this, the feeding and reproduction and nursery function of the marsh was still happening relative to the mummy chogs. But as you go down this, it changes. It's decreased recruitment because the nursery habitat's reduced, and there's further decrease in recruitment. By late in the invasion, like that tall invasive form slide I showed you, feeding, reproduction, and nursery function are eliminated. So this is sort of a sterile habitat, at least for fishes. So we're compounding sea level rise effects, climate change effects, and an invasive form. What about the future? This image shows some of the area that I have shown you before. This is the Sheepshead Meadows Peninsula. Seven Bridges Road goes down here. The area in red shows the area that will be flooded almost all the time with 1 foot of sea level rise. And so we're going to lose that. We're going to lose that marsh if this is accurate. But the question is, when is 1 foot of sea level rise going to happen? Some people say it, and they say it more frequently of late, that it's going to be around 2050, which is not very far away. That won't matter to me because I won't be dead. I will be dead. uh, and I hope, well, I don't want to get buried, but that's another seminar. Uh, uh, but things are going to change. Things are going to change dramatically. And we have to think about that at the station as well as other things. And it's going to happen. This is a LiDAR image of the same peninsula, and it's colored by elevation. So this is the Mystic Islands area up here. You can see Seven Bridges Road. You can, if you squint, you can see that these areas are a little bit higher because they are the approaches to the bridges. You can see the fish factory over here on Crab Island, and it's elevated for a whole host of reasons. This is a dredge spoil site. This is a dredge spoil site, and there's an old one down here. So this is very good at picking out the elevation. So what's going to happen is pieces of the road, well, pieces of the road, we're going to have more islands. The islands are going to be these dredge spoil sites. There's going to be the fish factory, and there's going to be parts of the road, but the rest of that peninsula, that marshy peninsula, will be gone. And then if we look at the whole estuarine system, in this image, blue represents 1 foot of sea level rise. The green, the light green represents 2 feet, and the red represents 4 feet of sea level rise. And again, the peninsula that the station is on is underwater at 1 foot of sea level rise. So there are changes. I was going to say there are changes coming, but no, they're happening now. They're happening now. If you're not paying attention, you might think they're subtle. If you pay attention, it will make you concerned. So with that kind of quick overview in mind, I'd be glad to try to answer any questions. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Ken. Really appreciate that presentation and where your career has taken you into these directions and a reflection of your naturalistic approach and sense of place and local ecology from the finfish and all these habitat issues that impact the finfish, but so much more. So thank you for bringing that knowledge to us here in tonight's seminar, your recent and upcoming books. Getting quite a few compliments thrown into the chat, but also some questions for you, Ken. So we'll take more knowledge from you while we have you. Robert was wondering, on all your maps and aerial photos, Are the shoreline edges normalized to mean high tide or anything else? Or are they different tide stages?
Yeah, there is some normalization that goes on, but some of the changes are so dramatic that it's not necessarily an index of, it's not a reflection of tide stage. But yes, they are to some degree normalized. So it's not like the 1930s images are at low tide and the current ones are high tide or something like that. That's not a problem.
Right on. Thanks,
Excuse
Ken.
me.
As we go through the questions, Amy is going to make the evaluation, the poll go live.
Yes.
So thank you for your help with that, Amy. We appreciate everyone's feedback that is willing to provide it in that brief evaluation survey.
Do I get to vote?
Yeah, you can grade yourself, Ken. That's unique. I don't know how many times you've had the opportunity for that, but go for it. Be
Yeah.
honest with yourself.
I'll pass. I'll pass.
Okay.
I
You will.
I don't trust myself to be that honest.
You will get a passing grade. So Kathleen's wondering, can we remove the invasive Phragmites?
There have been extensive efforts to do that in New Jersey. One of the most extensive was in along the Delaware Bayshore, where it's just rampant. And PSE&G, the people who own the nuclear power plant there, in exchange for negative effects of the power plant, they were attempting to remove Phragmites. And they did all kinds of things. One of the most dominant was spraying it with glyphosate to kill it, burning it, but it just kept coming back and they'd have to do it again and again and again. And it has, in my estimation, has relatively little value as a way to get rid of Phragmites. And again, some people would say, we don't want to spend that much money on trying to kill something that's going to come back, especially if it raises the elevation of the marsh. But to my knowledge, we have not had found an effective, safe way to eliminate Phragmites.
Thank you for that, Ken. There were two other related questions too, so that hit a couple with one response. Kathleen's also wondering, where does the marsh go? Does it just break up and dissipate into the bay, or you showed it calving off, but do those structures stay underneath, or do they erode away?
Yeah, they actually, and we followed some of these over time with side scan sonar, and we've actually sampled around those clumps. We call them peat reefs on the bottom, and they provide habitat for a while, but then they just erode away and disappear. Now, maybe that sediment ends up back on the marsh surface or is washed out of the estuary. We don't know. We haven't attempted to trace it, but it just sort of dissolves over time.
Good. Robert was wondering, this is something else you hit on a little bit, but if you have any further thoughts, while you're losing edge ecology under sea level rise, are you not creating new edge ecology, although maybe too fast?
You're creating more edge, that's for sure, unless you lose the whole marsh. And that we don't know if that changes the productivity. And similarly, that's a good question. Similarly, I don't know, and I don't know that anybody else does know about the productivity on the surface of the marsh where these lakes are being formed. Are they very productive? Do fishes do well in them? We don't know the answer to that yet. So there are just a lot of unknowns. I hope there are a lot of students out there who are willing to take on some of these questions.
Yeah. I trust they are. We have a diverse audience. I know some are young technicians and students, so Hopefully they're hearing the calls. How does the current drought, is that affecting the marsh ecology?
Good question. I don't know the specific answer to that. I'm sure it's not helping. When we have droughts in the past, not as severe as this one, we have droughts in those pools that are not connected to creeks or the rest of the bay do dry down, and sometimes they will dry all the way down to the substrate. But it's going to vary with their location, and but it some of them certainly do dry down, and a broader effects on the marsh grasses. I couldn't say.
Right on. Thanks, Ken. The chat is keeping me busy, which is good. Have one from Patricia, last name Donahue. She just noted that you were her professor during her master's work. And she's wondering, recall a sewage treatment plant experimenting with Phragmites to uptake heavy metals from sludge. Is there any evidence that the reeds are serving this function in the estuary?
Some people have tried to do that at sewage treatment plants and so on, particularly maybe heavy metals, but also nutrients, and they are pretty good at that. But those are local effects, and only probably affect something on the order of an acre, and we're talking about thousands of acres that are being invaded by Phragmites. So yes, useful at a small scale. No, probably not very useful at a large scale.
Right on. Thanks, Ken. Jody's wondering, is there any way to dig channels to drain these lakes? They know they are doing this as part of a recovery for the seaside sparrow in Massachusetts.
Yeah, he may be thinking of what they call runnels sometimes, and people have attempted to do that. But remember, this was done to the nth degree beginning in the 1900s. We now call them mosquito ditches, and they're all over the place, and they haven't solved the problem. And they haven't solved the mosquito problem either. So I wouldn't try that approach.
Can you, Giannis is wondering, can you speak to the Barrier Islands at all? At Seacon Island or any of the other Barrier Islands, maybe around that you've studied? You seeing similar response, or are they?
Yeah, the sea level is rising. Sea level is rising everywhere. And so it's all about the elevation. And we can see that from driving down the road. There are places in the road that are lower in elevation and they get flooded more often. We see places that are higher in elevation that have red cedars growing on them. And some of these cedars have been there since the road was constructed in the 1930s. So even at the scale of the road, there's lots of variation. And I think that's true from the front side of a barrier island to the back side and from individual barrier islands as well. So sea level is rising. It's going to be a local effect, and it's hard to have a simple answer to that kind of question.
And maybe depending upon what Barrier Island's thinking about, but a lot of the Barrier Islands are also much heavily more developed than what you showed. So there are a lot of hard structures trying to fight erosion.
Yeah, yeah. But the problem is, and it's really obvious if you get up in the air and look at Long Beach Island. At the southern end of Long Beach Island, it is moved to where there is no bulkheading, where there is no human habitation. The southern end of the island is moved to the west. And that's what's happening in barrier islands everywhere. So you can put a bulkhead in and probably maintain your house, buildings, roads, whatever, for a while. But what happens with 1 foot of sea level rise? What happens with 2 foot? And it depends on it depends on elevation.
Fred is wondering, so you showed that one plot from the boat basin. I guess, are you seeing an increase in flooding frequency, it sounds like?
Flooding frequency,
Yeah.
I'm not sure. That is not going to have much impact on flooding frequency. The station is it was built by the Coast Guard in the 1930s, and it sits about 9 to 10 feet above the marsh surface. So we don't have much flooding. We had minor flooding during Sandy, but we're somewhat immune because of the elevation of the buildings themselves. But again, the road is at a lower elevation, so getting there is part of the issue.
Mhm. Does that figure that you show the number of the days that the roadways flooded, that gives maybe an indicator of flooding frequency?
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure,
Yeah.
for sure. It's variable from year to year, but the point of the graph was it's increasing over time.
Yeah. Uh, a question came in: how does water pollution, such as plastic or other, affect estuarine function or any of the erosion you're seeing? Pretty broad question, Ken.
Yeah, here's where I revert to the answer I give my students. I don't ever hesitate to say when I don't know, but I don't know.
Mhm. Fair enough. We've had some seminar speakers in the past in the spring cover, maybe it was last fall already, all the small things with big environmental impacts. We covered microplastics in a few
Oh yeah, no,
seminars.
I'm not saying it's not an issue. I'm
Oh,
just saying I can't answer the question. Microplastics are a problem, no doubt about it.
yep. All right, just about two more maybe for you, Ken. Paul asked, and a few others did, are there any volunteer opportunities that are related to this monitoring, for example, on kayaking or other?
Yes, there's the volunteers at the station. Most of them actually come through the Jacques Cousteau National Estuarine Research Reserve. So if you go to their webpage, I'm sure I can't think of who's running that. Well, you may know, or Amy may
Christine
know.
Moran.
Oh, yes, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Christine was a former volunteer. I should have known that. Yeah, so Christine has a good handle on it. There are lots of opportunities to get involved in a whole host of things, especially if you don't mind getting wet, muddy, and being out in the marsh after midnight.
Yes, there's so I put in the contact information for the JC near staff.
Great.
Christine Moran at the bottom is the volunteer coordinator.
Right.
In addition, the Barnegat Bay Partnership has the Paddle for the Edge program, which is
Right.
also very much related to your question there, Paul, to monitor the coastline by citizen science on kayaks.
Yep.
Uh, one more while we got you, Ken. Related, Kathleen, is there anything else other that people can do to help the marsh from calving off or helping to fight sea level rise in the context of the work you presented tonight?
That's a hard question. It's tough, you know, stop burning fossil fuels, uh, get an electric vehicle, uh, all these kinds of possibilities that aim at the larger global climate change problem and the associated sea level rise. Um, in your backyard or especially if you live next to a marsh, you can do things at the local level and try to encourage people to find beneficial uses of sediments. One of the things that's receiving a lot of attention, and we've done some work on, is using dredge spoil sediments to build up the marsh. And our preliminary work on a very small scale says that can be done, and other people are doing well. There's a lot going on at the Wetlands Institute and so on. So again, I think the volunteer activity is one of the best ways to do that, to help the scientists understand the system better.
Good answers there, Ken. And one others that's come up in the past, I just put the link in the chat. Jersey friendly yards, landscaping for a healthier environment. There are some recommendations in there for native plants in particular, and also environmentally friendly ways that in different watersheds, which we're all in a watershed somewhere in the state, we can in a more healthy manner maintain our own properties.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Awesome. Got through the questions efficiently there, Ken. Thank you very much again for taking the time to make the presentation with Nicole's assistance, as you noted earlier. Thank you, Nicole. And thanks for spending your time with us this evening, Ken, and sharing your knowledge and staying a little longer than expected to answer everyone's great questions. Thanks to those who participated, filling out the poll to provide your feedback. Hopefully you all enjoyed this evening. Plus, if you've been a participant in any of the other 6 seminars we had this fall, focusing in on changes in our local environmental conditions here in New Jersey. The recording of this seminar will be posted along with the others. Thanks to my colleagues from the Earth Day Everyday team to help prepare and execute this seminar series. We're all standing by to help answer any questions you might have, and we'll see you in the spring with topics to be determined. If there's something you want to learn about, you can ask us in a question or contact us for a recommendation for future webinars or resources. Thank you all for spending your time with us and taking the time to learn more about Southern New Jersey's estuaries and other topics this fall.
And thanks for the invitation, Doug.
Of course. Thank you, Ken. Much appreciated, including all the legwork to prepare to deliver a great talk tonight.